The morning I found out, I was making pancakes. That's what gets me every time I replay it. The absolute ordinary of it. The butter melting in the pan. The smell of coffee. The sound of birds outside the kitchen window of the house I had spent 7 years making into a home. I wasn't looking for anything that day. I wasn't suspicious. I wasn't even unhappy. I was just making pancakes. And then my whole life cracked open like an egg on the edge of that pan, quietly, suddenly, with no warning at all. His phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at it out of habit, the way you do when you've been married to someone long enough that their phone feels as familiar as your own. The preview on the screen read, "Last night was everything. When can I see you again?" I stood there for a full 10 seconds. Maybe longer. The butter started to burn. I didn't move. I picked up the phone. I read the message again. And then I scrolled up. I wish I hadn't. But I did. And what I found in those messages wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It wasn't a single lapse in judgment. It was a relationship. A full, detailed, intimate relationship, months of it, with a woman named Jenna who lived 20 minutes away in the next town over. My husband Daniel had been living a double life. And I, the woman who had stood beside him at the altar, who had quit her job to support his business dreams, who had given up her apartment in the city to move to this small town because he said it was where he wanted to raise a family, I had no idea. Not one. But let me back up. Because you need to understand who I was before that morning. Before that phone. Before Jenna's name existed in my world. You need to understand what I had given up to be Daniel's wife. I grew up in Chicago. South Side. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knew your name and your grandmother's name and exactly what you got on your last report card. My mother worked double shifts at a hospital for 20 years. She didn't complain once. She just put her head down, worked, and made sure her daughters had what they needed. I watched her do that my entire childhood, and I promised myself 2 things. 1, I would work just as hard as she did. 2, I would marry someone who worked just as hard as me. I kept both promises. Or so I thought. I was 31 when I met Daniel at a conference in Indianapolis. He was charming in that easy, confident way that doesn't feel forced. He laughed at the right moments. He listened, actually listened, when I talked. He remembered small things. He called when he said he would. He was, for every visible reason, a good man. We dated long distance for 8 months. Then he proposed. Then we moved to Clover Creek, the small town in Ohio where he had grown up and where his father's hardware business was waiting for him to take over. I left my marketing job. I left my friends. I left the city I had lived in for a decade. I did it because I loved him. Because I believed in us. Because I thought that when someone shows you who they are consistently for 2 years, you can trust what you see. I was wrong. The first year in Clover Creek was genuinely hard. I won't pretend otherwise. I didn't know anyone. Daniel worked long hours at the store. I was applying for remote work, decorating the house, learning which gas station had the best coffee, trying to build a life in a place where I felt like a guest at someone else's party. But I didn't complain. Because this was what we had agreed to. This was our plan. I found a remote consulting job within 6 months. I joined the town's small business committee. I made a few friends, Karen from the yoga class I started going to on Thursdays, and Mira, who ran the bakery 2 streets over from the hardware store. I was building something. Slowly, but genuinely. Daniel seemed happy. We had dinner together most nights. We took weekend drives. We talked about kids, not urgently, but with the comfortable ease of people who assumed that chapter was coming, just not yet. By our 4th year in Clover Creek, I thought we were settled. I thought we were solid. I thought we were fine. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. I think about them constantly, the way you pick at a healing wound even knowing you shouldn't. He started going to the gym more. I thought, good for him. He began taking longer routes home from work. I thought, he's probably decompressing. He got a second phone for work purposes. I thought, the hardware store was expanding, it made sense. He started sleeping with it face down on the nightstand. I thought, he was just being tidy. None of those things alarmed me individually. Together, they were a map I didn't know how to read. Or maybe I just didn't want to. I need to tell you about the 6 months before I found those messages. Because they matter. Daniel had become distant. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make anyone look up from their own life and say, something is wrong here. But in the small, daily ways that quietly hollow a marriage out. He stopped reaching for my hand when we walked. He stopped asking about my day with any real curiosity. He started going to bed before me, which was new. He had always been a night owl. I asked him, twice, if something was wrong. Both times he said he was just stressed about the store. Inventory issues. A difficult supplier. He was convincing. He had always been convincing. I believed him. I told him I was there if he needed to talk. I made his favorite meals. I gave him space when I thought he needed it. I tried to be a good wife to a man who was out there being a terrible husband. The morning of the pancakes, I had actually been feeling better about us. We had spent the previous evening watching a movie on the couch together. He had put his arm around me. We had laughed. It felt like something was shifting back toward normal. I went to bed thinking, maybe we're coming out of it. And then his phone buzzed, and I picked it up, and I read those words, and the ground disappeared from under me. Last night was everything. When can I see you again? Last night. While I slept beside him in our bed. Or maybe before he came home. The timeline was there in the messages. I kept scrolling, kept reading things I couldn't unread, kept assembling a picture I desperately didn't want to see. They had been together for at least 8 months. Maybe longer. He called her on his lunch breaks. He drove to see her on Saturday mornings when he told me he was playing golf with his brother. He had taken her to a restaurant in Columbus that he had told me was too far when I'd suggested it for our anniversary. He had told her he loved her. He had told her he was unhappy. He had told her, and this is the part that broke something in me that I'm still learning to rebuild, he had told her that his marriage was basically over. That he was just figuring out his exit. His exit. While I was making his lunches and decorating his house and building a life in his hometown and trying to be his partner, he was planning his exit. I put the phone down. I turned off the stove. I sat down at the kitchen table and I did not cry. I think I was too far past crying at that point. Something else was happening inside me. Something colder and clearer than tears. I thought about my mother. About those double shifts. About putting your head down and working and not complaining. I thought about the apartment in Chicago I had given up. The job. The friends. The version of myself that had existed before Clover Creek. And then I thought, he does not get to decide when this is over. I do. When Daniel came downstairs that morning, he found me sitting at the kitchen table with his phone in front of me and 7 years of marriage in my eyes. He looked at the phone. He looked at me. And before I even said a word, before I could say a single word, he said, "Sarah, it's not what you think. It never is. It always is." What happened in the next 3 hours was one of the worst conversations of my life. He admitted it, eventually. He had to, the evidence was right there. He cried. He said he was sorry. He said he had gotten lost. He said Jenna didn't mean anything. Then he said she did mean something but that he still loved me. Then he said he was confused. He kept changing the story. Every time I pushed, the shape of it shifted. Like he was trying to find the version that would hurt me least, or the version that would save him, or maybe both. I sat across from him at our kitchen table and I watched a stranger explain himself to me using my husband's face. By the time I asked him to leave, I was done. Not done in a rage. Not done in a collapse. Done in that quiet, terrible, final way. The way a door closes when no one slams it, just a soft click and then silence. He packed a bag and drove away. I watched his truck disappear at the end of our street and then I went back inside and I finished making the pancakes. I don't know why. I just did. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever ignored warning signs in a relationship because you simply didn't want to see them? Maybe you noticed something, felt something, but talked yourself out of it? Tell me in the comments, because Sarah's story is one so many people recognize in themselves, and I want to know if you do too. In the weeks that followed, I learned things about my own marriage that made me feel like an archaeologist sifting through ruins. Friends told me things they had been afraid to say. Karen from yoga class admitted she had seen Daniel's truck parked outside a house on Birchwood Lane, Jenna Street, 3 separate times. She had told herself it was probably nothing. She hadn't wanted to be the one to blow up my life. I don't blame her for that. I understand it completely. Daniel's brother Marcus called me. He was clearly uncomfortable, clearly guilty, and he told me in halting, careful sentences that he had known something was off for months. That Daniel had said things, vague things, about being unhappy. That Marcus had told him to talk to me. That Daniel had said he would. He hadn't. Daniel's own brother knew more about the state of my marriage than I did. That was its own kind of wound. And then there was Mira, from the bakery. Sweet, warm Mira, who had become one of my closest friends in Clover Creek. Mira told me that Jenna came into her bakery sometimes. That she had never connected the name until now. That Jenna had once, in passing conversation, mentioned she was seeing someone who was complicated. That she had seemed neither proud nor ashamed of it. Just matter of fact. Complicated. That's what I was to the woman who was sleeping with my husband. I was a complication. I filed for separation 3 weeks after that morning. I hired a lawyer in Columbus, not a Clover Creek lawyer, because in a town that small, everyone knows everyone and I was not about to have my divorce become neighborhood gossip before the ink was dry. Daniel asked if we could try counseling. I said no. Not because I believed counseling couldn't work for people. But because I knew, with the kind of clarity that comes from having read 8 months of messages to another woman, that I didn't want to save this. I wanted to survive it. Those are 2 very different things. The separation was clean, at least legally. The house was in both our names. We sold it. I took my half. I took my furniture. I took the framed photo of my mother from the hallway wall that Daniel had never even glanced at. I left Clover Creek on a Tuesday morning in October, with my car packed and the early mist still sitting on the cornfields at the edge of town. I did not look back. I wanted to. But I didn't. What I want you to understand, and this is important, is that the betrayal wasn't just the affair. The affair was the loudest part. The most obvious part. The part that would be written on any legal document as the reason for the marriage's end. But the actual betrayal? The deeper one? It was the years of performance. Of him constructing a version of our life that existed only for my benefit while he quietly built another one I knew nothing about. It was the deliberate, sustained choice to let me keep loving him, keep investing in him, keep uprooting myself for him, while he was already halfway out the door. That's what I couldn't forgive. Not the woman. Not even the lies. The choice. Made over and over again. To let me stay in a marriage he had already abandoned in every way that mattered. And that, I thought, was the whole story. I left. He stayed in Clover Creek. We signed the papers. I moved back to Chicago. I thought I knew exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible. Then, 4 months later, I got a phone call from Jenna. Hold on. Stop right there. Because I need to know what you're thinking right now. You've heard Sarah's side, every painful detail, every missed sign, every quiet devastation. And you believe her, right? She was blindsided. She was betrayed. Daniel is clearly the villain here. But here's what I want you to do, drop a comment right now and tell me, do you think there's anything Sarah might not know? Anything she might have missed? Because part 2 is about to make you question everything. Stay with me. Daniel did not set out to destroy his marriage. That's not an excuse. It's a starting point. Because the version of events that Sarah experienced, real and devastating as it was, is not the only version that exists. And before we reach the truth, you need to sit with Daniel's side. Even if it's uncomfortable. Even if you don't want to. Because somewhere in the discomfort is where the real story lives. Daniel had grown up in Clover Creek his whole life. The son of Robert Hartley, who had built Hartley Hardware from nothing, who had worked 60-hour weeks for 30 years, who had raised his sons with a very clear and unspoken message: this business is the family's legacy. You protect it. You continue it. You don't walk away. Daniel had never questioned that. Not openly. Not to anyone who might repeat it. But privately, quietly, in the part of himself that he rarely showed anyone, he had always wanted something different. He had wanted to study architecture. He had sketched buildings in notebooks all through high school. He had applied, secretly, to 2 universities in Pittsburgh. He had been accepted to both. He never went. His father had a health scare the summer before college. The timing felt impossible. Daniel told himself, next year. Then next year became the year after, and the year after became a decade, and eventually the architecture notebooks ended up in a box in a closet that he never opened. He took over the hardware store at 26. He was good at it. He told himself that was enough. When he met Sarah at that conference in Indianapolis, something happened to him that he didn't fully understand. She was everything Clover Creek wasn't. Ambitious. Urban. Full of plans in motion and a kind of forward energy that he had stopped allowing himself to feel years ago. He fell for her quickly and genuinely. That part was real. But he also, and this is the part he has never said to anyone but Jenna, he also loved her partly because she felt like an escape. Like a version of himself that could exist outside the walls of his father's town, his father's store, his father's expectations. He proposed because he loved her. But also because he thought, maybe she'll take me somewhere else. Instead, she came to Clover Creek. He had asked her to. He had wanted her there. He hadn't understood yet that bringing the person you associate with freedom into the place that makes you feel trapped doesn't set you free, it just adds one more thing you feel guilty about. The first 3 years of their marriage, Daniel tried. He genuinely tried. But the trying felt like holding his breath. And you can only hold your breath for so long. He watched Sarah build a life in Clover Creek with more grace and resilience than he had ever managed in the town where he'd spent his entire life. She made friends. She found work. She made the house beautiful. She showed up, fully, to a life she had never chosen for herself. And he felt, this is the part that doesn't make him a hero, but is still true, he felt increasingly small next to her. He had asked her to sacrifice everything. And she had done it, cheerfully, without complaint. While he stayed exactly where he had always been, doing exactly what he had always done, feeling exactly what he had always felt. He didn't know how to tell her that. He didn't have the language for it. He had been raised by a man who treated emotional honesty like a character flaw. So instead of talking, he went quiet. And instead of going quiet, he went further. He met Jenna at a hardware supplier's trade event in Columbus. She was a sales rep for a paint company. She was funny and straightforward, and she did not look at him with the particular brand of hopeful patience that Sarah had begun to wear like a second skin. Jenna didn't need anything from him. She didn't have a plan that involved him. She just liked him. It was the first time in years someone had liked him without also needing him to be something. He knew it was wrong. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he would end it. He told himself that 100 times over 8 months. He didn't end it. Here is what Daniel would tell you about those 8 months, if he were sitting here. He would tell you that he did not stop loving Sarah. That he was aware, every single day, of the magnitude of what he was doing. That there was no morning he woke up next to his wife and felt nothing, the guilt was constant, crushing, present. He would tell you that he told Jenna things about his marriage because he had no one else to tell them to. Not because his marriage was over, but because he had no mechanism for saying hard things to the person he actually needed to say them to. He would tell you that his exit, those messages Sarah read, were the words of a man in crisis, not a man with a plan. That he had said things to Jenna in moments of despair that he didn't mean as literal truths. That he was catastrophizing to someone who felt safe, because catastrophizing to Sarah felt like detonating a bomb. He would also tell you, and this is the part that changes the shape of everything, that he had tried to tell Sarah something was wrong. Twice. Once, 6 months before the morning of the pancakes, he had sat at the kitchen table after dinner and said, "I feel like I'm disappearing." Sarah had looked up from her laptop and said, "What do you mean?" And he had not known how to answer. He had shaken his head and said, "Nothing, I'm just tired." She had nodded and gone back to her laptop. She had believed him. She had no reason not to. The second time, 3 months later, he had started a conversation about the store. About feeling trapped there. About wishing things were different. It had lasted about 4 minutes before Sarah's phone rang, a work call she had to take, and by the time she came back, the moment was gone. He had never tried again. He had chosen silence over the terrifying vulnerability of honesty. And then he had chosen Jenna over the terrifying vulnerability of fixing his marriage. Those were his choices. He owns them. But they were not made in a vacuum. When Sarah found the messages, Daniel was not surprised. Some part of him had been waiting for it. Had maybe even needed it, the external force to end what he could not end himself. He cried that morning at the kitchen table. The tears were real. He was not performing remorse, he was inside of it, suffocating. When he said, "It's not what you think," he meant it in the only way that phrase can ever be truthfully said, the facts are what you think, but the meaning behind them is more complicated than what you're seeing right now. He did not get the chance to explain that. She asked him to leave. He left. He has regretted the leaving every single day. Not because he wanted to fight for the marriage, he understood by then that it was over. But because he left without saying the things that actually needed to be said. The things that might have let both of them understand what had actually happened in that house over 7 years. After Sarah moved to Chicago, Daniel ended things with Jenna. Not immediately, there was a painful, messy month of unraveling. But it ended. He stayed in Clover Creek. He kept the store. He started seeing a therapist in Columbus, something he had never allowed himself to do before, and for the first time in his adult life, he started talking about the architecture notebooks. About his father. About the holding of breath. His therapist told him that the affair was a symptom. That it was the outlet for everything he had no other way to release. Daniel does not offer this as an excuse to anyone. He does not say it to make himself a sympathetic figure. But he says it to himself every day as a lesson about the cost of silence. He had never learned to ask for what he needed. And in not asking, he had taken everything from the person who deserved to be asked. Okay. I need a moment here, and I think you do too. Because Daniel's side is uncomfortable in a very specific way, isn't it? He's not innocent. Not even close. But there's something in his story, the architecture notebooks, the moment at the kitchen table where he tried to say he was drowning and couldn't find the words, that makes it harder to draw a clean line. So here's what I want you to do right now. Comment below, who do you hold more responsible? Daniel for his silence and his choices? Or is there something in this marriage that both of them missed? There's no wrong answer. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if you're watching this on Puel's Reader for the first time, this is what we do here. We go deeper. We don't just take sides. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. But here's the thing about Daniel's side. It is not the whole truth either. Because Jenna called Sarah 4 months after the divorce was finalized. And what Jenna said, what she revealed, reframed everything. Sarah almost didn't answer. She was back in Chicago by then, in a small apartment in Lincoln Park, 3 weeks into a new job at a marketing firm. She was rebuilding. It was slow and sometimes it felt like trying to build a house in a windstorm, but she was doing it. When the unfamiliar Ohio number lit up her phone on a Thursday evening, she almost let it go to voicemail. She answered. Sarah? This is Jenna. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from. But there's something you need to know. Something I should have said a long time ago. What Jenna said in the next 40 minutes changed the shape of everything Sarah thought she understood about her marriage. Not because it made Daniel innocent. He wasn't. Not because it made Jenna sympathetic. That's a more complicated question. But because it revealed a third version of the story, one that neither Sarah's pain nor Daniel's guilt had fully captured. Jenna had not known Daniel was married when she met him. That was the first thing she said, and Sarah sat very still while she said it. Daniel had not worn his wedding ring to the trade event in Columbus where they met. He had introduced himself simply as Daniel Hartley from Clover Creek. He had asked for her number. He had called her 3 days later. He had not mentioned Sarah for 6 weeks. When Jenna found out, from a colleague who happened to know someone in Clover Creek, she ended it. Immediately. She told him he needed to go home and fix his marriage or end it, but that she was not going to be the other woman. She was clear. She was firm. Daniel came back to her 2 weeks later. He told her his marriage was over in every way that mattered. That they were living as strangers. That Sarah knew things were wrong and had agreed, implied, he said, implied that they were on their way to separating. Jenna had asked him directly, "Does Sarah know you're seeing someone?" He had paused, just a beat too long, and said, "She knows things are bad between us." Jenna had taken that as a yes. She shouldn't have. She knew, somewhere in herself, that she shouldn't have. But she did. She had continued the relationship wanting to believe, that she was not destroying something that still existed. That she was a chapter in a story that was already closing. She had been lied to as well. But that was only the first part of what Jenna needed to say. The second part was about the money. Sarah had always handled the household finances. It was something they had agreed on early in the marriage. She was better with numbers, more organized, and Daniel had happily handed it off. She paid the bills. She managed the savings account. She handled the joint account with meticulous care. What she hadn't known, what she found out from Jenna that Thursday evening, her hands going cold around her phone, was that Daniel had opened a second personal account 8 months before she found those messages. Not to fund the affair. That wasn't it. The account was in Daniel Hartley's name only. And into it, steadily, over those 8 months, he had been depositing portions of the hardware store's cash revenue. Not large amounts. Never large enough to trigger obvious concern. But consistent. Accumulated. Jenna had found out because Daniel, in one of his more unguarded moments, had told her he was putting something aside. She had assumed it was savings for a fresh start. She had not asked more. She wished now that she had. When Sarah's lawyer had reviewed the financials during the divorce proceedings, the primary joint account had looked clean. Because it was clean. Daniel had been careful about that. The second account had never come up. Because Sarah hadn't known to look for it. Jenna gave her the name of the bank. She gave her the approximate amounts. She said, "I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe because I should have told you 6 months ago. Maybe because I've been trying to sleep at night and I can't. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry for my part in this. And I'm sorry that I let myself believe his version of the story for as long as I did." Sarah sat in her apartment for a long time after that call ended. She thought about the morning of the pancakes. She thought about the kitchen table and the quiet click of the door. She thought about the drive out of Clover Creek in the October mist and the way she had made herself not look back. She thought about 7 years. About Chicago and the conference in Indianapolis and the architecture of a marriage she had believed in completely. And then she called her lawyer. The financial investigation took 11 weeks. At the end of it, the second account contained $63,000. $63,000 that Daniel had quietly redirected from the hardware store over 8 months, money that, under Ohio law, as marital assets accumulated during the marriage, Sarah had a legal claim to. The divorce had been finalized by then. The house proceeds had been split. But financial fraud in the context of divorce is taken seriously, and Sarah's lawyer was very, very good. The settlement, the revised settlement, came 4 months after Jenna's phone call. Daniel paid Sarah $31,000. Half of what he had set aside. He did not fight it. Perhaps because he couldn't. Perhaps because somewhere in him, he understood that the debt was real. But I want to be honest with you about something, because this story deserves honesty. The money mattered. Of course it mattered. It was validation, in the bluntest and most concrete possible form, that what Sarah had felt, the sense that she had been managed and maneuvered rather than loved and respected, was not paranoia. It was true. But the money was not the ending Sarah needed. The ending she needed was the one she had already given herself, standing at the kitchen table, turning off the stove, sitting down. The ending that said, "He does not get to decide when this is over. I do." She had already begun building the only life that was fully hers to build, not a life she moved to, not a life she supported, not a life organized around someone else's needs and silences and unspoken regrets. Hers. Built from scratch, in the city she had originally chosen, with the version of herself she had been before anyone asked her to be anything else. A year after Jenna's call, Sarah was sitting in a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, working on a pitch for a client she had brought in herself. The apartment was hers. The work was hers. The calendar on her phone was full of dinners with friends who had known her before Daniel and friends who had found her after him. Her mother called that evening, the way she did every Thursday. They talked for an hour. At the end of the call, her mother said, "You sound like yourself again." Sarah looked out the window at the street, at the city moving past in all its noise and speed and indifferent beauty. "I am," she said. "I really am." And this is the part where I want to say something directly to anyone watching who recognizes something in Sarah's story. Not the affair. Not specifically that. But the slow, quiet erosion of yourself inside a relationship. The way you can look up one day and realize you've been making someone else's pancakes for years while your own hunger went unmet. The way love, even real love, can be used as a vehicle for someone else's avoidance. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to stop waiting for someone to say the thing they never learned to say. You are allowed to close the door quietly, walk to your car, and drive toward whatever life still belongs entirely to you. Sarah did. And she will tell you, it is on the other side of that drive that you remember who you were before you forgot to keep being her. $63,000. Hidden. Quietly moved, piece by piece, while Sarah managed their household finances with total honesty. I want to know, when Jenna called, did you expect that? Did you see it coming? Or did that change everything you thought you understood about Daniel? Because here's what strikes me about this story. Sarah thought she was the one who didn't know how to read the signs. But Daniel had structured things very deliberately so that she couldn't. That's a different thing entirely. Tell me what you're thinking right now. The comments are open. Sarah's story is one of the most layered ones we've told on Puel's Reader, because it refuses to be simple. Daniel isn't a cartoon villain. Jenna isn't just a homewrecker. Sarah isn't just a victim. They're all people who made choices, and some of those choices caused irreparable damage, and real life rarely gives us clean narratives. But here's what is clean: Sarah left. Sarah rebuilt. Sarah found out the truth and used it, and then she put it down and kept walking. That is what survival looks like. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just one foot in front of the other until you remember your own name. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps Puel's Reader reach people who need to hear stories like this one. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do. We go deep here every single time, and there are more stories coming that you do not want to miss. Now, final question, and I want your honest answer in the comments. If you were Sarah, and you got that call from Jenna, would you have taken the money and walked away? Or would you have needed something more, an explanation, a confrontation, a moment where Daniel finally said the things he never learned to say? Tell me. I read every single one. This has been Puel's Reader. Take care of yourselves, and each other.